So, good morning, everyone. So, I'm Benoît Quesnel, one of the RA in charge of the Source-to-Sink project at Université Laval and collaborating with the Goldfield Window project also at Université Laval. So, today I'm going to present some results and updates related to our project. But before to do that, let me reintroduce our general project Source-to-Sink. All of the projects related to the Source-to-Sink project deal with the understanding of the auriferous fluid flow systems active in deformation zones and at the origin of orogenic gold deposits. So here is the Source-to-Sink team composed of most of the professors from the department, of PhD and MSc student, one postdoc, and two research associates. These different projects are the result of collaboration with industrial partners from Abitibi and Ontario, and with academic collaborators from Quebec and France. So all of our projects deals with the understanding of parameters that control gold endowment. And more specifically, we try to determine what are the source of fluids and volatile by determining what are the geological processes driving fluid release and from which lithologies the fluid are derived from. On another hand, we try to determine if spatial variations of fluid flow mimic the irregular distribution of gold mineralization. In other words, what are the fluid flow conditions to form a deposit? And finally, we also focus our work on the timing of gold mineralization using the geochronology of accessory minerals in veins in order to determine the time frame of hydrothermal fluid events. Our strategy is to compare endowed and less endowed area at different scale. At superior scale, for example, by comparing the less endowed Wabigoon to the well-endowed Abitibi, but also at transect scale and deposit scale. So here are the different projects of our team. All of the students will present their work during this partner meeting, and Yasaman talked of her project during the first day, dedicating more specifically to geophysics projects. The two Guillaume, Isaac, and Michael will present their work just after me. So now let's move on the projects we are working on with Christophe, the regional isotopic survey systematic. The idea of this project is to compare the stable isotope composition of minerals and fluids at various scales between endowed and less endowed areas in order to determine what are the fluid flow conditions to form an orogenic gold deposit. So in the worldwide database, we compile stable isotope composition of vein minerals associated to orogenic deposits from the literature. At the superior scale, we also built a stable isotope database, including data from the literature and data from samples collected along transects. And finally, we also focus our work on specific deformation zones in order to perform detailed study of spatial variation of fluid flow, and for example, in the Molly-Degagné deformation zone and along the Cadillac-Ladder Lake deformation zone. So we already presented our work related to the worldwide database, and this work is currently in press. We already presented preliminary results on our superior province database, and we are currently waiting for complementary data to complete this database and to provide final interpretation at the superior scale. And we already present our work on the Molly-Degagné deformation zone, and this work is currently accepted with revision. So today, I'm gonna present the result of, more specifically, the result of our study focus on the Cadillac-Ladder Lake deformation zone. And I will also present results on one of our additional study, not directly associated to our isotopic survey. And the idea of this study was to investigate the potential of clump isotope thermometry as a tool that could be eventually used to study high temperature hydrothermal system And we tested this technique on carbonate minerals from the orogenic veins from the Augmito-Bouzan segment. So as I said, the idea of this project is to determine if scale of observation matters. In other words, are fluid sources, processes, fluid flow conditions are comparable at various scales and between endowed and less endowed areas. So at each scale, we determine the variability of isotopic mineral and fluid composition, as well as temperature of formation as function on various parameters, such as the location of the deposit, the nature of the host rock, etc. And today I will present the results of our study, mainly focused on the Cadillac-Larder Lake deformation zone. The idea has been to sample numerous orogenic veins all along the Cadillac-Larder Lake deformation zone in order to build a data set making possible the identification of spatial variation of fluid composition all along the break. So we focus our sampling between Rouen and Val d'Or, and we combine our data with data available in the literature. Our strategy was to determine if variations of mineral isotope composition, fluid isotope composition, or temperature of equilibrium were correlated to various parameters, such as the location of the sample along the break, laterally or vertically, the depth of sample, and the nature of the country rocks. The main observation we did is that the delta weighting values of minerals, quartz, tourmaline, chlorite, and carbonate, all display a spatial variation along the break. So this is very well illustrated when looking at the quartz, where two main zones can be defined. A western zone enriched in O18 compared to an eastern part of the break. So when interpolating the data using kriging method, the spatial variations become highlighted, and we see that we have a lateral east-west variation, but also a north-south variation, with Val d'Or area displaying quartz significantly depleted in O18. So we show that these two domains of high and low delta weight O18 composition of quartz converge close to Malartic, where the Cadillac-Larder Lake deformation zone displays a large inflection. And the first question is to determine if this variation of composition are related to variation of temperature or the fluid of temperature of the fluid, or to variation of isotopic composition of the fluid itself. When looking at the temperature, we see that the temperatures are really very similar all along the Cadillac-Larder Lake deformation zone, with no significant variation, between the different segments of the Cadillac. And this strongly suggests that the variation of the oxygen isotope composition of minerals is mainly related to variation of oxygen isotope composition of the fluid itself. So a first piece of answer is related to the nature of the country rocks. Indeed, delta weighting value of fluids that circulated in sedimentary rocks are commonly high, in gray on this diagram, whereas low delta weighting value of water are mostly documented for fluids that circulated in igneous rocks. Because sedimentary rocks have higher delta weighting values than igneous rocks, we can suggest that the nature of the host rocks could have contributed to modify the composition of the fluid by fluid buffering process. However, because a significant number of high delta weighting value are also documented for fluids that circulated in volcanics, in green on this diagram, fluid buffering cannot explain by itself the spatial variability of oxygen isotope composition of fluids and minerals all along the Cadillac. Here we can see the variation of the oxygen isotope composition of the fluid regarding the temperature of the fluid. As usual, we show that fluid mixing between an upper crystal fluid reservoir and metamorphic fluid reservoir is a common process documented all along the cardiac lake deformation zone. However, we also show that two different metamorphic fluid reservoirs are needed to explain the two different trends identified on this diagram. This suggests that the source rock from which the metamorphic fluids are derived were probably heterogeneous at depth. So the variable proportion of volcanic versus sedimentary rocks could explain such variability because these types of rocks have different oxygen isotope composition. But we could also imagine that, the most significant proportion of volcanic rocks are found at depth in the Val d'Or area compared to the Rwanda area where sedimentary rocks could be more abundant at depth. Alternatively, we could also imagine that the temperature of devolatilization of rock at depth would have been different, inducing variation of oxygen isotope composition of the fluid released from the same source rock. Interestingly, we also document the existence of two types of metamorphic fluid reservoir by comparing the fluid composition according to the temperature from various locations worldwide. In Abitibi, we show that the source of fluid that circulated at Timmins and Larder and Kirkland Lake was different than the source of fluid that circulated in the Val d'Or area, and that the source of fluid from the Lille-Garde Craton is very similar to the source of fluid from the Val d'Or area. So the important point is that we document different types of metamorphic fluids at various scales, and does it represent the involvement of different types of source rock or different temperature of devolatilization of rock at depth? The reason why these fluids do not have the same composition remains open. So this sketch summarizes the model we propose to explain the spatial variability of oxygen isotope composition of fluid and mineral along the Cadillac. If fluid buffering by host rock likely occurred, we propose that the main parameter is the variable composition of metamorphic fluid released at depth. And we suggest that the Pontiac rock have heterogeneous oxygen isotope composition at depth, and that this variation in composition could be related to variable proportion of sedimentary and volcanic rocks at depth. We suggest that the two different metamorphic fluid systems were active in western and eastern part of the break respectively, and that they only converge around Malartic along the significant inflection of the Cadillac-Larder Lake deformation zone, suggesting that the convergence of these two distinct hydrothermal systems could be of importance for gold mineralization at Malartic. And what we show using oxygen isotope is finally consistent with what Benoît et al. Suggested in their 2018 paper. Indeed, they documented a structural discontinuity in this area, in the Malartic area, that they interpreted to be of importance for the channelization of orogenic fluid flow along the Cadillac-Larder Lake deformation zone. So now let's move to the clump isotope thermometry study. So what is clump isotope thermometry? This means measuring the excess of C13 and O18 bonds within the crystal, carbonate crystal relative to random distribution of this isotope within the carbonate mineral. When they form at isotopic equilibrium, the abundance of these bonds is a function of temperature, and it is thus possible to obtain the formation temperature of the carbonate mineral. And the power of this method is that we do not need to do assumption of on the initial isotopic fluid composition. So because carbonate minerals are ubiquitous in veins and in altered rocks in high temperature hydrothermal system, we propose to test the applicability of clump isotope thermometry in high temperature hydrothermal environment as a promising tool to reliably determine the temperatures in this type of systems. We focus this study on mesothermal calcite from the Ogmito-Bouzan orogenic system because this area has been extensively studied by Guillaume Raymond. So we have a lot of constraints in terms of temperature, in terms of composition of the vein. We have a really good knowledge of the geological background of the area. And as I said, this area has been extensively worked by Guillaume. So the main result of our study is that all temperature calculated from clump isotopes measurements are all significantly lower than the temperature expected for orogenic gold system. So more precisely, when comparing temperature calculated using delta weighting equilibrium between quartz and calcite and temperature calculated using clump measurements on the same calcite, we see that the temperature calculated with the classical delta weighting thermometer are consistent with what we could expect for orogenic gold deposit, whereas clump temperature are really significantly lower than the expected temperature for this system. So what we show in this study is that significant solid state reordering occurred during the cooling history of our sample. So the solid state reordering is the isotopic bond reordering in the crystal lattice without altering the crystal nor its bulk isotopic composition. It can occur during prograde or retrograde history. And this solid state reordering partially reset the initial clump temperature. In other words, initial temperatures of formation are not preserved, and we only document the final equilibrium temperature that depends on the temperature history of the sample. So on this figure, you can see in black the temperature time path of ABTB, and in color the different scenarios of evolution of temperature of equilibrium, of clump temperature of equilibrium through times, using different model of solid state reordering available in the literature. And as we see just here, all scenarios provide temperature range that fit well with our data that are in blue. So what is the conclusion of this study? The conclusion is we still have hope. Indeed, each carbonate mineral has a closure temperature, which means a temperature below which solid state reordering will be avoided. So to test the applicability of this method in high temperature hydrothermal system, it requires to use refractory minerals, which means minerals with closure temperature higher than the temperature of the system that we want to study. So future studies focused on the use of dolomite, ankerite, siderite, or magnesite are needed. And for some of this mineral, it requires a new analytical calibration of the clump isotope thermometer. So a significant work of method development. So to conclude, here are the different contributions we are working on. Several articles being in press, accepted with revision, under review, close to be submitted, and 2 final projects which are in progress, for which we always are waiting for final results. Thank you for your attention.
Benoît, it's Ross here. What are you, you've done a lot of work off in the Wabigoon. What are your plans for a lot of that data?
Yeah, we just received the final result of our analysis, so we have to process the data. And the idea is we are really close to have the entire database ready to be interpreted. So in the next week, months, we will have a good idea of what is the variability of the fluid composition between ABTB and Wabigoon, and what is the variability of of temperature of the orogenic fluids that circulated in all these deformation zones, with a specific focus on the Geraldton area for the Wabigoon.
Okay, thanks.
I must also say, Russ, that we are using the compilation of data from the Larder Lake area to expand the current analysis that is completed in the 2 segments of the Keswick-Larder Lake fault. So that's going to be combined with the data that was shown today.
Yeah, well, that would be interesting because you got a much different, you don't have Pontiac to the south of Larder Lake, right? So if you're looking at different fluid reservoirs, that could, but you might have a third reservoir. Okay, thanks.